Hello and welcome to the 2-minute warning interview where we ask what is next and most importantly what should be next in the global energy transition. Is the upheaval in the world's energy market moving fast enough now in order to hit the climate goals of tomorrow? The resounding answer at the moment is no. My name is 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐥𝐥𝐢𝐧𝐠. I am the Director of the Energy Transition Dialogues at Gulf Intelligence, and I'm very glad to have Nandita Prashad with us today. Nandita is the Managing Director of the Sustainable Infrastructure Group at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We all commonly know that as the EBRD. Hello, Nandita. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, Michelle, and thank you very much for having me.
No, not at all. I'm very keen to hear what you've got to say on this conversation and to hear your insights. Let's start with money. It seems like a strong spot to start. At the moment, there's this clear gap between the need for investments to tackle climate change and the reality of current financing and what is actually happening. So the OECD estimated in 2017 that investment of $6.9 trillion per year over 15 years in clean energy infrastructure would be needed to keep the global temperature rise under 2 degrees. 2017 now, especially with COVID, feels like a long way away, and especially with the huge developments that we've seen in technology and especially renewable energy prices being in some cases at parity or cheaper than fossil fuel prices. Against that background, what do you think should be the priority going forward in the next year when it comes to climate financing?
Thank you, Michelle. You're absolutely right. And you know, there is some not very good news out there in the sense that we're not moving fast enough, but there's also some very good news. And you alluded to one of the best pieces of news, which is how cheap renewables are now. And so actually some of those estimates from 2017 have actually come down quite substantially. We just saw at the beginning of this week the launch of 2 very good reports, and I'm going to do a plug for them because I'm actually a commissioner of the Energy Transitions Commission that just released these 2 reports. One is making clean electrification possible, setting out why it's essential, feasible, and now affordable to multiply the global power system by 5 in the next 30 years, while shifting to renewable-based electricity provision. And a parallel report on making the hydrogen economy possible, because it's very clear that we need to push clean hydrogen, which has to play a role in decarbonizing the sectors that are hard to abate or impossible to electrify. And why I think these 2 reports are so important is because they really show what needs to be done. They show that it's possible, that it's affordable, but we need to get our skates on now. And of course, the most important element in all of this is going to be finance, because without finance, we're not going to get moving on any of these things. But interestingly, their estimates, so this is a 2021 estimate, is about $2 trillion a year. And so you can see from that headline figure that you talked about from 2017 to 2020, actually the number has come down.
Plummeted even.
The costs have come down. And because technology is allowing us to do so much more for less now. But I think the time to act is now. And if we start to lose the momentum now, that bill is only going to go up. It's going to go up.
There is that appreciation, isn't there? As you just said, the slower we are now, those huge savings we've made, far more than that, multiple trillions that have been made, that bill is only going to get higher. And we're seeing that for every US dollar, and they're varying estimates, but for every US dollar invested in the energy transition, the payback is $6 to $8. And the economics are very much working in our favor now.
They are indeed, but also there's also the risk that if we don't move quickly now, no matter how much money we throw at it, we won't get there. And right now there is a huge, with COP26 coming later this year, countries have woken up, but not just countries, companies, industries, they've woken up to the fact that they need to get their pathways sorted now for net zero, and they need to get working on actual concrete actions. So I'm really hoping actually that COP26 is beginning to have that galvanizing effect and hopefully gets us from the rhetoric to the action.
For all our sakes, I certainly hope that that is the case. And if anything about the last year has taught us is that when there is a need, global cooperation and solutions can be found incredibly fast when there is that pressing need. And arguably the bell has been ringing for climate. It's just not been ringing loudly enough. Of according to many people, but it certainly has been ringing. And you just mentioned that.
Sorry. No, I'm just going to say, Michelle, and perhaps one thing I should have said as well, and this is wearing my EBRD hat, is a lot of that investment momentum and action has to happen in developing countries. And that's really, really important to realize as well, that that's where we need to see the money flowing. And there is a lot of money out there. We just need to get it to where it's needed most.
It's the most important, perhaps also it's the most difficult. With, for example, one of the conversations we had last week on this platform, we were told that India is unlikely to set a net zero target before 2070. China is 2060, and other big world economies are 2050. From the point of view that India, as has the long old age argument between developed and developing nations when it comes to this and climate mitigation and the finances available for it, is, developing nations are still developing. That's exactly the point. And in terms of bringing those climate mitigation actions in and the cost associated with those as well, that it's much more difficult for them, whereas developed nations have already gotten their gold, as it were. And developing nations are still accruing them, and in many cases have much larger populations as well. So do you think that is still an argument going forward with developing nations, and it's going to make that conversation much trickier?
Well, I think, we have one of the largest economies in the world now back at the table on this discussion. And we heard already from President Biden at the recent climate summit, the recognition that more help needs to go to developing countries to make this happen. Because if India leaves us till 2070, we can forget it. The world can forget it. We're not going to get to our Paris goals. I
think it's after 2024, it's going to be the world's largest population, overtaking China, according to the UN population.
And it's also got a huge fleet of coal-fired power plants.
Huge.
Retired, that need to be closed. So it's very, very clear. There is a clear understanding that there will need to be much more focus, much more help to developing countries to get them to decarbonize faster. And without that, it doesn't matter what the developed world does themselves. We won't get there altogether.
Just zooming out a bit to the private sector investment side of things. So at the moment, the Green Climate Fund, the private sector manages more than $210 trillion in assets, but only a minor part of that is dedicated to climate investments. And we're seeing more and more ESG growth. We're seeing major companies, world-leading companies. I think it's half of the FTSE 100 now pay their executives based on their ESG targets and their ESG progress as well. So it's hugely threading into the need for climate investments and awareness and so on. What do you see happening for the rest of this year in terms of spurring that private sector investment in climate mitigation?
So you're absolutely right, Michelle, and we are seeing this, right? We're seeing on the one hand the huge needs, and on the other hand, we are seeing the stimulated appetite, as it were, for finance and investment, looking for sustainable places to be. What we see as really the role, even for institutions like ourselves, is to find a way to develop enough projects in the developing markets and using these projects to then attract private investors and private investment. So we see the need to bridge this gap between where the needs are and the money that's out there looking for a home. So I think this is something we've been quite focused on at EBRD. How do we mobilize private investment into our markets and put it to use, not just for the climate challenge, but also the recovery from this pandemic? And this is something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about these days. And based on our experience, the key thing is driving policy reform in the countries. The capital is available, increasingly looking for sustainable areas of investment, but what investors need is the right opportunity. Countries where policymakers are making credible long-term commitments to the transition and also setting clear rules and the strong regulatory frameworks on the back of these commitments. And this is where we are focusing right now, working with our countries to develop those net zero carbon pathways or low carbon pathways, helping them put the right policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks in place to attract private investment. And let me very quickly, Michelle, mention three things that we're doing right now at EBRD, which is particularly designed.
Just before you go on to that, I just want to clarify a point you just made, and then I'd love to hear about these 3 points. So you're saying that there is plenty of climate-related finance available. It simply needs a home.
Well, I think, I don't any longer call it climate related finance. I think mainstream finance is moving to green. I think mainstream finance is looking for sustainable places to be. You look back to 2 years ago, nobody in finance was talking green. Today, everyone's talking green. You've got all these institutional investors out there, this enormous amount of capital sitting in institutional investor hands, looking for a home with a lot of pressure from all of their stakeholders to invest in green. This is probably the one silver lining coming out of this pandemic. This complete focus now on green. So I don't think of this as climate related financing. I'm thinking of mainstream financing. How do we get mainstream financing to work for green and the recovery?
And you also said as well that your focus at the moment is very much about the COVID recovery, but also about supporting the environment and greener financing. And do you very much see those as interlinked? One cannot survive without the other?
Absolutely. What we see is an opportunity for a green recovery. We've seen how green can actually stimulate economies, right? We've seen the data on this. Renewable energy, the kind of jobs it can help create. And what's really particular about renewable energy is it's not just jobs in total. It's very specifically what local benefits these projects can bring. And in very, unlike fossil fuels, not focused or concentrated in some areas, but can be right throughout a country. We always talk about one very exciting project we did a couple of years ago in Egypt, this enormous solar farm in the middle of the desert, the Benban project. Well, that project created 10,000 local jobs in an area that was total subsistence economy till this project came around. So, it's a very powerful, green can be a very powerful tool for helping us all recover from what we've been this past year.
10,000 is a hell of a lot.
And these are jobs, they're low skilled jobs, but they're jobs putting cash in the hands of families that had never had cash before. So, it's just to give you a sense of what the impact can be locally as well in projects like renewables. But maybe
do you want to take us through those 3 points that you mentioned, just because I want to talk to you about green financing mechanisms. So if you want to take us through those 3 points.
Exactly. So I think it's a very good lead in, because this is, how do we actually create the opportunities for green financing to flow into, right? That's what we're focusing on at the moment. And how do we stimulate economy? So the 3 things that we're doing, which are really, really crucial to this. One is we have a public-private partnership program where we currently actually provide direct advice to countries to develop PPPs. And we've got about 20 PPP advisory mandates on at the moment, mostly in social infrastructure, logistics, transport, all designed to create a pipeline of sustainable, transparent, and competitively tendered, and most importantly, bankable projects to attract private investment. The second area where we're putting a lot of attention is helping countries design renewable energy auctions. We've seen in country after country, competitive tenders for renewables deliver the lowest prices. And so we're supporting, I think now up to 14 countries in actually designing and implementing renewable energy auctions. And we've seen even during the pandemic, how these can attract substantial private investment and deliver record low prices. And we've seen this in countries like Albania and Uzbekistan just in this past year of COVID. And then finally, it's a
sorry, when we talk about those low prices, we're talking about prices sometimes that are lower than fossil fuels, the cost of fossil fuels.
Substantially lower. We're talking substantially lower than fossil fuels.
And there's a huge trigger for changing the sentiment surrounding this.
Absolutely. And just think of that and combine that with creating jobs in new parts of these countries. And the third, which is it's a flagship program of EBRD we're particularly proud of, is what we call our EBRD Green Cities program. One thing we have to remember is cities around the globe now account for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a trend that's only going to rise with increased urbanization. So cities are very vulnerable to climate change as well. And so this is a program that we've designed where we work directly with cities to prioritize, develop, and finance transformational environment and climate-related infrastructure projects. And we're working now on about 47 cities. And very interesting, again, during the pandemic, we've actually seen interest from more and more cities to join this program. And this program is another way in which we identify projects and investments that can attract private finance and clean and green finance. And by the way, the Green Climate Fund has been a big partner of ours in this program.
You mentioned just then, was it 41 countries? Cities, sorry. How many of those are in developed nations? Roughly, what is the split?
So these are 47 countries from the EBRD countries of operation. So these are from our 38 economies that we work in, which, as you know, span 3 continents, because we're in Central and Eastern Europe, all of the former Soviet Union, all the way to Mongolia, Turkey, and also parts of MENA.
Excellent, thank you. And how can we feed in that need for green financing mechanisms into our whole conversation? I feel like this is a very good summary question for a chat that's touched on a lot of different areas. And what would you say in terms of green financing mechanisms today are needed, and how have you seen that market develop over the last 5-6 years since the Paris Agreement, really? And what do you hope they're going to look like as well? How mature do you hope these mechanisms get?
So I would say, Michelle, look, we're definitely seeing at the moment a lot more innovation, a lot more mechanisms coming to the market, you know, and particularly mechanisms designed to attract institutional investor appetite, because I think that's where it's that huge amount of institutional capital that is looking for a home. And so what we're seeing increasingly, of course, are things like green bonds, and more recently, sustainability linked bonds and loans. And just to give you 2 examples, we recently did the first sustainability linked bond for the Greek utility, which is a utility that is absolutely committed to getting off all coal by 2025.
Wow.
And very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets. And this was a bond instrument that designed to attract institutional capital. And we acted as one of the anchor investors in that. To really have it create, actually, because the first of its kind high yield sustainability linked bond. So to start to create a market for such mechanisms. But you see, I mean, what I think about those kinds of products and those mechanisms is they go beyond the energy sector. As we see companies, industries needing to also make their transition to net zero, if they are to be competitive in this market going forward, which is surely going to have carbon taxes and carbon prices. These kinds of mechanisms can be very powerful to bring capital to help industry decarbonize. And just yesterday, we actually participated in a green bond of a logistics and real estate provider working across a number of East European countries, which has made a commitment to net zero by 2025. So I think financing mechanisms linked to the pathways and the commitments and the ambition that countries and companies are setting for themselves is really going to be the way forward, because I think to be called green, it has to be linked to actual outcomes. So I think mainstream, so I really think that the more of that kind of linking to green, the more of the taxonomy we have around green that we can do, we will start to see more and more mainstream financing coming into that space.
Nandita, thank you very much for all your insights. We've covered a huge amount, and it'd be great to...
I'm going to say one last plug, though, which I should have to conclude that point, because you also asked me, what do I see needed for the future?
I did ask that.
What we need for the future is we need to see this kind of financing at much greater scale, but also, and I will end where I started, going to developing countries, because right now it's there in sort of the middle income, high income. We need these mechanisms to take much more risk for social and green return and get to the developing markets and developing countries, because that's the way we're going to save the planet.
And so much of the urbanization that you touched on as well is going to be happening in those nations as well. So it all very much ties together. I think I'm going to use the phrase that you used at the beginning, which was to get the skates on, and that everybody very much needs to do that. I think that's a very colloquial but very effective way to get the point across, that the sense of urgency is intense, and it's intensifying as well. Thank you very much, Nandita. And like I was saying, I really hope that you can join us again maybe towards the end of the year and give us an update on where things stand, because everything's moving so fast that it's good to keep abreast of it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michelle. Lovely talking to you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.